on a tree about 2,000 years ago. And while he was hanging on that tree, he was cut in the side, making it possible for you and I, who weren't born ethnically Israel, to come into this family God calls Israel. He did that about 2,000 years ago, or if I can put it to you this way, 2 millennial days ago. Because a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So 2 days have passed, and so now we find ourselves on the threshold of the 3rd day. And what do we see happening? We see that these non-Jewish people who become part of this family are beginning to open our eyes to something that we've never seen before. We're beginning to realize some things, just as Joseph began to realize some things. And by the way, when did Joseph reveal himself to his brethren? It wasn't the first time they visited him, or shall I say the first day. It wasn't the second time they visited him, or shall I say the second day. No, but it was on the 3rd time, the 3rd day. This is when things that have been concealed are going to be revealed. You and I are beginning to see things that we never saw before. In fact, the prophecy in Romans 11 acknowledges that that would happen. As a matter of fact, if we go down to verse 25 of Romans chapter 11, this is what Paul says. He says, "For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery." And what is a mystery? Something that's been hidden, but now it's being revealed. "Lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." Blindness in part, partial blindness, has happened to Israel. Now, most people have always understood that to mean that the Jews didn't know who the Messiah was. And so they've been blind. Well, I'll agree with that, but you need to understand that there's only a partial blindness here. In other words, they're not completely blind. If they don't see the Messiah, what is it they do see? I'll suggest to you that they see the commandments. They see the Torah. They see the obligation of God's people to obey God's commandments. But on the flip side of that coin, we see this. Paul has gone to great lengths to show you and I that you and I, represented by this wild branch, have been brought into this family called Israel. And so we are part of Israel. And so consequently, that partial blindness affects us as well. And so if we've been partially blind and we see the identity of the Messiah, what is it we haven't seen? We haven't seen what the natural branch has seen. And that is the obligation for God's people to keep His commandments. Torah, in other words. But what Paul says is that this partial blindness continues until the fullness or the completion of Gentiles. In other words, when the wild branch that's brought in ceases to be partially blind. In other words, begins to see everything. In other words, when things that have been kept concealed are now being revealed. When they begin to see with both eyes, that's what leads to this happening. And thus it is written, all Israel shall be saved. You see, again, Paul was not a New Testament scholar. He was a Torah scholar. And so when he spoke of the fullness of the Gentiles, or the completion of the Gentiles, he borrowed from what he knew in Scripture. And specifically what that phrase deals with is when Joseph brings his 2 sons to Jacob to be, for one of them, the oldest, to receive the birthright and the blessing. But you'll recall that when he brings his 2 sons, that Jacob asks him, whose are these? And he says, they're mine. He says, well, in a manner of speaking, not anymore. They're mine. Jacob, Israel, adopts these 2 sons. And I'll suggest to you that when Manasseh and Ephraim comes to Jacob, they don't look like Hebrews. They look like Egyptians. But nevertheless, he adopts them. He brings them into the family. He says, they're mine. There shall be as Reuben and Simeon. And then he goes to bless, not Manasseh, but with Ephraim, the second-born. And he places his right hand on Ephraim's head, and he says, and in you, Ephraim, shall be the multitude of nations. The Hebrew phrase is Melo Hagoyim. And if what that means, Melo, completion or fullness, Hagoyim, the nations, or the Gentiles. In other words, it's the same phrasing that Paul uses in Romans 11. He says, in essence, that in you shall be the fullness of the Gentiles. In other words, when you who have come to Israel looking like pagans, if you will, Those of you who have been outside of this family, but who now have been adopted into this family. When you come into the realization that you are part of this family and consequently should begin to act like part of this family, and you begin to understand that, and how did we come into this family? Because the Messiah made it possible. When you begin to see the fullness of these things, then it says, that's the completion of the Gentiles. That's the fullness of the Gentiles. And that is the key that leads to all Israel being saved. Because why was Joseph ultimately placed in Egypt? He understood by the time this story ends. He understood why he was there. Because he said, what you intended for harm, God has intended for good. God sent me before you to preserve life. And so when he says, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, has to mean that, yes, the pit, being sold into slavery, being placed in prison, falsely accused, that was all part of God's plan. Being elevated to power was all part of God's plan. But also being made to look like an Egyptian, being made to speak like an Egyptian, married to an Egyptian wife, married into the family that leads the nation in idolatrous worship,